She laughed first. That was the thing nobody could forget. Afterward, she laughed first loud enough for the whole bank to hear without knowing a single thing about the man standing in front of her. One woman. One moment of cruelty dressed up as confidence. And a little 7-year-old girl who squeezed her daddy's hand so tight, his knuckles went white. But here's what nobody in that bank knew yet. The man Victoria Sinclair just humiliated in front of 30 strangers. Yeah, he owned part of this building they were standing in. Drop a comment below with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. And if you believe every person deserves basic respect, hit subscribe. This one's going to stay with you. The Tuesday morning started the way most of Ethan Walker's mornings did, quietly, without ceremony, and always with Emma. She was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes wide and brown and serious in the way that only children's eyes can be serious, like they're measuring something in you that adults stopped measuring a long time ago. She was wearing her favorite jacket, pale yellow, a little too big for her, with a cartoon sun stitched on the left pocket that had started fraying at the edges. Ethan had offered to buy her a new one 3 times already this fall. She refused every time. This one still works, Daddy. That was Emma, practical in ways that quietly broke his heart. He held her hand as they pushed through the glass door of First National Bank on Caldwell Street. The kind of downtown branch that had marble floors and high ceilings that made your footsteps sound more important than you felt. The morning crowd was already thick business people, young professionals, a couple of retirees near the far counter. The kind of Tuesday crowd that moved fast and looked at their phones and didn't particularly notice anything that wasn't directly in their way. Ethan didn't mind being unnoticed. He'd built a life around it, actually. He was wearing his flannel, the dark green one, with the frayed left cuff he kept meaning to replace. Worn Timberlands that had seen too many job sites. His hair needed a cut. He hadn't shaved since Saturday. He looked by any reasonable outside assessment like a man who worked hard with his hands and worried quietly about the end of the month. That was intentional in its own way. He'd never been the kind of man who needed his outside to match what was on the inside. He got in line. Emma pressed against his side, one hand hooked around 2 of his fingers, and watched the rope dividers with the focused curiosity of a child who finds the ordinary world genuinely interesting. "Daddy, why do they use those velvet ropes?" she whispered. "Like at the movies." "To keep the lines organized," he said. "Do people not know how to make lines by themselves?" "Some people," he said. "Not most." She considered this with great seriousness, then nodded like she'd filed it away for future reference. They were 4 people back from the counter. Nothing remarkable about the wait. Ethan pulled out his phone and checked one message from his accountant. Something about the Q4 portfolio restructuring he'd asked about last week. Read it, typed a brief reply, and put the phone away. Emma was now quietly counting the ceiling tiles. 44, she announced. "You sure?" "Pretty sure. I might have skipped one." "We'll count them on the way out," he said. She smiled and went back to her counting. He didn't see Victoria Sinclair at first. She was off to the right near the private banking offices that lined the east wall, the kind of glass-walled rooms where the bank kept its wealthier clients comfortable with leather chairs and bottled water and a different class of conversation. She was there with 2 colleagues, young men in well-tailored suits who stood at slightly different angles to her, the way planets orbit something with more gravitational pull. Victoria Sinclair was 38 years old, and she had earned, by most accounts, the right to occupy space the way she did, fully confidently, with the quiet assumption that rooms were meant to accommodate her. She'd built her company, Sinclair Digital, from a 2-person startup in her apartment to a firm that now managed digital infrastructure contracts for dozens of mid-size corporations across the Southeast. She was profiled. She was photographed. She was, in the particular language of her world, someone. She was also, on this particular Tuesday morning, bored. The meeting with the private banking advisor had run longer than expected and delivered less than promised, and she was standing near the edge of the lobby, waiting for her colleague Marcus to finish a call so they could leave and get to the 11 o'clock. She was checking her watch. She was scanning the room with the absent-minded restlessness of a person accustomed to always moving toward the next thing. That's when her eyes landed on Ethan. She didn't know she was doing it exactly. It was the kind of glance that happens without a decision, a quick automatic calibration that the wealthy sometimes perform on the poor without even being conscious of it. A 2-second read. She took in the flannel, the boots, the unshaven jaw, the little girl hanging off his fingers. She looked away, then looked back, issuing. Because he'd reached the front of the line now, and the teller, a young woman named Danny, according to her name badge, who had been having a perfectly pleasant morning, was smiling and asking how she could help. And Ethan said calmly, and without any particular self-consciousness, "I'd like to make a withdrawal. $50, please." Victoria heard it. She wasn't trying to. But the lobby had a way of carrying sound, all those hard marble surfaces bouncing noise around. And his voice was clear and ordinary, and completely unremarkable. $50. She didn't mean to laugh. She would tell herself that later in the long, uncomfortable review she would conduct of that morning. She would tell herself it was just a sound that escaped involuntary, a reflex. But that wasn't quite true. Yeah. She laughed, and she turned to Marcus, who had just finished his call, and she said not quietly enough, not quietly at all. $50. He came all the way downtown to take out $50. Marcus gave a short, complicit smile. The kind you give when someone above you signals that something is funny. One of the other colleagues, Derek, 26, still learning what the room expected of him, laughed more openly. A woman nearby, standing with a leather briefcase and not affiliated with anyone, heard the tone, if not the words, and glanced over and smiled in that vague way people do when they sense a joke they haven't quite caught. The sound spread that soft ripple of condescension, and it was quiet enough that most people in the bank didn't register it consciously. It was the kind of cruelty that lives in the frequency just below outright rudeness, deniable, sophisticated, contained. But Ethan heard it. He heard every syllable of it. He didn't turn around. He didn't tense up, not in any obvious way. Danny the teller was pulling up his account, and he kept his attention on the counter, and his expression didn't shift by a single degree. But Emma heard it too. Danny. And Emma. Unlike her father, didn't have 35 years of practice at letting things slide off the surface. She was 7. She turned her head toward the sound, with the unfiltered directness of a child who doesn't yet know she's supposed to pretend she didn't hear things. She found Victoria with her eyes immediately, this tall, immaculate woman who was still half smiling, and Emma's own expression moved through several things in quick succession, confusion, and then recognition of something, and then a tightening around her mouth that Ethan felt more than saw. He squeezed her hand once. She turned back to the counter. But her grip on his fingers had changed. It wasn't the loose, comfortable hold of a few minutes ago, the handhold of a child wandering through an interesting world. It was tight. It was two-handed now, both of her small hands wrapped around his 2 fingers, and she pressed herself slightly more against his leg. Ethan's jaw worked just once, almost imperceptibly. Then he said to Danny, "Take your time." And his voice was perfectly even. Victoria, for her part, had already moved on. Or thought she had. She was back on her phone, something about the 11 o'clock agenda, and Marcus was recapping the conversation with the advisor, and the whole minor moment of humor at the flannel-shirted man's expense had lasted perhaps 30 seconds of her morning, and was already dissolving into the general background noise of her Tuesday. She didn't notice, for instance, that the woman with the leather briefcase had stopped smiling and was now looking at her with something considerably colder. She didn't notice the older gentleman near the deposit slips, who had straightened up slightly in the specific way that men of a certain generation straighten up when they've witnessed something they consider poor form. She was not in this moment tracking the responses of the people around her. She was too accustomed to those responses being favorable. So she didn't notice that Danny the teller had paused. It was a small pause. Professional. The kind where you've seen something on a screen that requires a second look, and you give yourself that second look without making a production of it. Danny had been a teller for 6 years. She had a well-developed ability to absorb information without her face immediately broadcasting it to the lobby. But something had happened on that screen. She typed something. Then she looked at it again. Then, still very calmly, she said, "Mr. Walker, would you mind holding on? Just one moment. I want to make sure everything processes smoothly for you." "Of course," Ethan said. Emma looked up at her father. "Is something wrong?" "No, baby," he said. "They're just making sure everything's right." "Okay." She went back to watching the velvet rope dividers. Danny had picked up her phone, the internal line, and said something into it quietly, with her body angled slightly away from the customer-facing position. 2 sentences, maybe 3. Then she set it down and smiled at Ethan, with the particular warmth of a person who has just confirmed something they're not quite sure how to handle. "Someone will be right with you, Mr. Walker, and I apologize for any delay." "Not a problem," he said. And then he waited. The man who came out of the back offices was named Gerald Hooper. He was the branch manager, 52 years old, heavy-set in a comfortable way, with the kind of face that had learned to be neutral over decades of banking, but could still be read by anyone paying attention. But he was paying attention when he came through the door. He was very specifically paying attention to where Ethan was standing, and he crossed the lobby with a speed and directness that was subtly but unmistakably different from the way branch managers normally move toward routine transactions. He extended his hand before he'd fully arrived. "Mr. Walker." Warm, certain. "Gerald Hooper, branch manager. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. We just wanted to make sure we take care of you properly today." "Gerald." Ethan shook his hand. "Appreciate it. I just need the 50. "Absolutely, absolutely." Gerald was already half-turned, gesturing slightly. "If you'd like to step into my office for a moment, I can have that processed immediately, and also—" "Counter's fine," Ethan said, not unkindly. "Emma and I have somewhere to be." Gerald paused for just a fraction of a second, recalibrating. Then, "Of course, Danny, go ahead and process Mr. Walker's withdrawal, and please make sure he has everything he needs." "Yes, sir," Danny said. The whole exchange had lasted under a minute. But in the specific acoustics of that marble lobby on a quiet Tuesday morning, it had carried. The woman with the leather briefcase had watched all of it. The older gentleman near the deposit slips had watched all of it. Several other people in the line and near the line, and not quite in the line, but present in that way that people in bank lobbies are present. They had all watched the branch manager come out personally, cross the floor quickly, and greet the man in the worn flannel by his last name before he'd said a word. The ripple went in the opposite direction this time, and Victoria Sinclair, who had not been watching, registered it anyway, the way you register a change in the temperature of a room without looking for the cause. She looked up from her phone. She saw Gerald Hooper. She knew Gerald. She'd met him twice in the context of Sinclair Digital's business accounts here. She watched him speaking to the man at the teller window with the little girl, and she watched the body language, and something moved through her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. She watched Ethan say something to the child. Emma looked up at him, and he said something quiet, and she nodded, like a small serious professor accepting new information. And then Danny counted out the bills, and Ethan tucked them into his wallet, with the careful, unremarkable manner of a man completing a task he had planned. Gerald was still there. He said something to Ethan, low, cordial, the tone of a person who would very much like to continue a conversation if the other person is willing. Ethan said something back. Both of them smiled, brief and genuine. Then Ethan turned, took Emma's hand, and walked toward the exit. He didn't look for Victoria. He didn't scan the room. He didn't let his eyes drift in her direction. He simply walked toward the door with his daughter unhurried, wearing his worn flannel and his faded boots with $50 in his wallet and somewhere to be. He passed within 8 feet of where she was standing. He didn't look at her. No. And something about that, the not looking, the complete and total absence of any interest in her reaction, landed differently than if he'd confronted her, or glared, or said something. She watched him push through the glass door with Emma. Through the window briefly she could see the girl say something to him on the sidewalk. She saw him crouch down to her level right there on the pavement and say something back. Emma laughed a big open laugh, the kind that takes over a small body completely, and then she grabbed his hand and they walked left out of the frame of the window. Victoria stood very still. "Ready?" Marcus said beside her. "1 second," she said. She was looking at Gerald Hooper, who was making his way back to his office. As if sensing it, he glanced in her direction. His expression was professionally neutral, the way it always was. But she had been in enough rooms to read what lived beneath professional neutral. And what she read in Gerald Hooper's face, in that half-second of eye contact before he continued walking, was something that felt uncomfortably close to disappointment. Not in Ethan Walker. In her. She would not ask Gerald about it that day. She would tell herself in the car that she was overreacting. She would tell herself that she didn't know what the branch manager's special attention meant. Maybe the man had some kind of account issue. Maybe it was routine. Maybe she'd constructed a story around nothing. She was good at constructing stories. It was in many ways why she was successful. "You don't know anything about that man," she told herself in the back of the car. Which was true. It was also, she realized, exactly the problem. She pulled up the morning's agenda on her tablet. She answered 2 emails. She confirmed the 11 o'clock, but the yellow jacket stayed with her, the fraying cartoon sun on the pocket, the way the little girl's hands had moved from one-handed to two-handed on her father's fingers, and the small tightening around her mouth that had happened and then been quietly managed by a 7-year-old who had apparently already learned something about managing things quietly. $50, Victoria had said. Out loud. In a room full of people. To a child who heard every word. The car moved through downtown traffic, and Victoria Sinclair looked out the window at the Tuesday morning, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt something that her success had quietly led her to believe she was no longer capable of feeling. Small. She didn't know yet what she didn't know. She didn't know about the portfolio. She didn't know about the investments that had been made 8, 10, 12 years ago by a quiet man who had trusted his instincts and his patience, and had never once needed anyone in a marble bank lobby to know about it. She didn't know the name on the brass plaques of 2 companies whose software her own firm currently ran on. She didn't know what Gerald Hooper had seen on Danny's screen. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was the laugh. Her own laugh replaying in her ears with the particular persistence of sounds we wish we could take back. And outside a bank on Caldwell Street, she didn't know that a little girl in a yellow jacket was asking her father a question. She didn't know what he answered. Not yet. The question Emma asked her father on the sidewalk outside First National Bank on Caldwell Street was not complicated. It was the kind of question that only children ask because only children have not yet learned to let certain things pass without naming them. "Daddy, why was that lady laughing at us?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He crouched down to her level right there on the pavement with people moving around them in both directions. And the Tuesday morning carrying on the way Tuesday mornings do, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by the small human moments happening inside it. He looked at his daughter's face, those serious brown eyes, her mother's eyes waiting for something real. Not a deflection, not a never mind baby, something real. "She wasn't laughing at us," he said. She was laughing at what she thought she saw. Emma processed this with the focused patience she brought to most problems. But she was wrong. "Yeah," he said. "She was wrong. Are you going to tell her that?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has already decided something and is at peace with the decision. "No," he said. "I don't think so." Emma tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because some lessons," Ethan said, standing back up and taking her hand, "are better when they arrive on their own." She thought about this for the entire half block before the ice cream place. Then she said, "Like when you let me figure out the math problem myself instead of telling me the answer." "Exactly like that," he said. She seemed satisfied. She ordered strawberry. He paid with one of the $50 bills and didn't think about the bank again until later that evening, when the city had gone quiet and Emma was asleep, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and his phone showed 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and 1 voicemail he hadn't listened to yet. He listened to it then. It was from Gerald Hooper. Not a transactional message, not a routine bank follow-up. Gerald's voice had a specific quality to it. Careful measured the voice of a man who has chosen his words in advance and is reading slightly off an internal script because the situation feels unusual enough to warrant that kind of care. He said he was calling as a courtesy. He said there had been an incident in the lobby that morning that he wanted Ethan to know the bank took seriously. He said if Ethan ever wanted to discuss his accounts in a more private setting, the branch would of course be happy to accommodate that. And then he said one more thing at the end that he probably hadn't planned to say because it didn't fit the professional register of everything before it. He said, "Your daughter seemed like a wonderful kid, Mr. Walker. I hope you two have a good evening." Ethan set the phone down on the table. He sat with that for a while. Gerald Hooper had been the branch manager of that location for 11 years. In 11 years, he had processed transactions for professional athletes, local politicians, a couple of fairly prominent real estate developers, and at least one person Ethan knew personally who appeared on regional Forbes lists. Gerald was not a man who called customers in the evening. He was not a man who mentioned their children at the end of voicemails. The fact that he had done both told Ethan something about how the morning had read from the inside of that marble lobby. He thought about calling Gerald back. Then he decided against it. He thought about what Emma had asked him on the sidewalk. Are you going to tell her? And his own answer? And he decided that the same principle applied here. He wasn't going to make something larger out of this than it needed to be. He wasn't going to summon anything. He was going to let the morning be what it was, a Tuesday that had been slightly worse than it needed to be, and move forward. He poured the cold coffee down the sink, checked the baby monitor out of old habit, even though Emma had been telling him for 6 months that she was too old for it. Went to bed. He was asleep by 10:15. He did not think about Victoria Sinclair again that night. Victoria Sinclair, however, did not sleep until after 2 in the morning, and she thought about almost nothing else. She had made it through the 11 o'clock. She had made it through a working lunch and 2 back-to-back afternoon meetings, and a conference call with the West Coast team that ran long in the way West Coast calls always ran long. She had done all of it with the surface-level competence that 11 years of building something from nothing had given her. She could run a meeting on 3 hours of sleep and a bad morning. She had learned that early on and leaned into it hard. But underneath the competence all day, there had been something running in a separate channel. A loop. The sound of her own voice saying $50, and then the image of Gerald Hooper crossing that lobby floor with a speed and a purpose that she could not stop re-examining. Because Victoria was smart. That was the thing that had gotten her here. The thing that had made Sinclair Digital real, instead of an idea she told people about at parties. She was genuinely functionally smart in the way that processes information quickly and accurately, and doesn't often make significant errors of judgment. Which was exactly why what had happened in that bank lobby was so difficult to set down. She had made an error. She didn't know the dimensions of it yet. She didn't know if it was a small error or a large one. She didn't know if the man in the flannel had a few $1,000s set aside, or something more substantial, or something entirely different from either of those options. What she knew was that Gerald Hooper had come out of his office personally and crossed the floor in under 45 seconds, and greeted that man by his last name, and stood beside him with the body language of someone managing a relationship, not a transaction. That didn't happen for everyone. That didn't happen for most people. She typed his name into a search engine at 8:17 in the evening, sitting in her home office with a glass of wine she hadn't touched. Ethan Walker. She paused before she hit enter, aware of some small interior resistance to doing it. Some voice that said this was a kind of capitulation, an admission to herself that the morning had gotten under her skin more than she wanted to acknowledge. She hit enter anyway. The results that came back were sparse. That was the first thing she noticed. In her world, the kind of world where presence and visibility were professional tools, sparse results usually meant one of two things. Either the person was nobody, or the person had deliberately and skillfully constructed their own obscurity. He's here. She clicked through the first page. A LinkedIn profile minimal, last updated 2 years ago, listing him as an independent investor and consultant. No photo. A reference in a trade publication from 4 years back, a technology conference, a panel on early-stage investment strategy. A single quoted paragraph attributed to an Ethan Walker of Nashville, who had made early bets on 3 companies in the healthcare technology space. She read the paragraph twice. It was not the quote of a man who didn't know what he was talking about. She found a second reference older 7 years in the business section of a regional newspaper, a short piece about a local investment group. His name appeared in a list. She almost skipped past it, and then she didn't, because beside his name in the article was a parenthetical that made her stop. She read it again. She set the wine glass down. She read it a third time. The parenthetical named a company. A specific company. A company that she knew in the particular way that you know the companies whose infrastructure quietly makes your own business function. Not because you talk about them, but because their name appears on contracts and service agreements, and the kind of back-end paperwork that runs underneath the visible surface of things. A company that Sinclair Digital had been a client of for going on 5 years now. Ethan Walker had been listed as an early-stage investor in that company 7 years ago. She went back to the search. She started pulling threads. She was methodical about it. This was how she solved problems. How she always solved problems, sequential and thorough, and willing to sit with incomplete information until the pattern emerged. It took her a little over 2 hours. The wine went warm and then cold. She didn't notice. What emerged over those 2 hours of quiet and careful research was the outline of a man who had spent roughly a decade making early bets on technology companies at the precise moment when most people would have called those bets either too small to be interesting or too uncertain to be worth the risk. Seed rounds. Pre-seed rounds. The kind of investments that happened before the story was clear, before the press release, before the round numbers that showed up in headlines. The kind of investing that required either extraordinary luck or an exceptionally calibrated sense of what was real before anyone else could see it. And from what she could piece together, and she could only piece together a fraction of it because this man had been consistently, almost aggressively private, several of those bets had paid off at multiples. She was genuinely uncomfortable putting into words. She sat back in her chair. She thought about this flannel, the faded boots, the unshaved jaw, and the tired eyes, and the way he had stood at that teller window, asking for $50 with the calm bearing of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. She had read him in 2 seconds. She had been wrong in every particular. Yes. Not just wrong about the money, though she had been spectacularly wrong about the money, but wrong about what the money meant. Because the thing that was slowly becoming clear to her sitting in her home office at 11:30 at night with her cold wine and her search results was that the money wasn't incidental to the story. The money was the story in a specific way. The money was the evidence that her whole framework for reading people, the framework she had trusted for years, the one that said she was a good judge, a fast judge, an accurate judge, was not what she believed it was. She had looked at Ethan Walker and seen struggle. She had looked at him and seen failure wearing flannel. And then she had opened her mouth, in front of his daughter. She pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. The city was doing what cities do at night, still moving, still lit, still indifferent, and she stood there with her arms crossed and made herself think about the little girl. The yellow jacket with the cartoon sun on the pocket. The way the grip had changed from loose and trusting to tight and two-handed, and the child had pressed herself against her father's leg without making a sound. Emma. She'd heard the branch manager say it. Emma. Victoria had made a 7-year-old girl hold her father's hand tighter in a bank lobby because she had laughed at the price of an ice cream trip. She let that settle. She didn't rush past it. She had spent 20 years getting good at rushing past the things that were uncomfortable to stay with, reframing them into something more manageable, something more consistent with her preferred self-image. She had an entire internal architecture built for that purpose, efficient and well-maintained. She stood at the window, and she let it settle anyway. She thought about what she said to Marcus. Not privately, not quietly, loud enough that the acoustics of a marble lobby could carry it to a man and his daughter standing 8 feet away. She thought about the way Marcus had smiled that quick, complicit smile, and the way Derek had laughed more openly, and the way that ripple had moved through the people nearby, and how she had registered none of it in real time because she had been so completely certain of her own read. I see a man withdrawing $50 and wearing worn boots, and I know everything I need to know. Except she had known nothing. She went back to the desk. She pulled up the research again. She found the name of the company one more time and sat with it. The specific company, the one that lived inside her own business, in a way she'd never quite examined before. The way infrastructure tends to become invisible when it works well. She opened Sinclair Digital's vendor management file. She scrolled to the right section. There it was. Her company had been paying a monthly service fee to a platform that Ethan Walker had invested in before it had a name anyone recognized, before it had a board, before it had an office. He had been there at the beginning, when it was still an idea that most people would have called too small to be interesting. He had seen something. He had bet on it. Boo! And now, every month, Sinclair Digital's operations ran on infrastructure that existed in some part because of a decision that man had made years ago quietly, in the way he did everything without needing anyone in a marble lobby to know about it. The CEO of Sinclair Digital. The woman who had laughed at the man withdrawing $50 was in some non-trivial sense a beneficiary of his judgment. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a long time. When she finally went to bed, she did not sleep well, and when she did sleep, she dreamed about the yellow jacket and the cartoon sun and the fraying edge of the pocket and a little girl's hands tightening around fingers that never let go. She woke up at 5:45 with a thought she couldn't shake loose. She had never in 11 years of building her company invested a single dollar based on instinct and patience and the willingness to be wrong in public. She had invested based on data and trends and expert consensus and all the reasonable tools of a reasonable person in her field. She had done well, genuinely well. But she had never seen around a corner the way Ethan Walker apparently had again and again for a decade. And she had stood in a bank lobby and laughed at him. The thought that arrived with the 5:45 morning and would not be dislodged was this: what if the quality that had made him who he was, the quality she had mocked, was exactly the quality she most lacked? What if the man who seemed like he had nothing was the person in that room who understood something fundamental that she didn't? She got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window while the city came back into itself. The light changing over the buildings she'd watched change for 6 years from this apartment. She had built something real. She was proud of it. She had earned the right to stand in rooms and be taken seriously, and she had worked for every inch of that, and she wasn't interested in dismantling it. But she was 48 hours out from a Tuesday morning that had showed her something about herself she had not been prepared to see. And the woman who had built a company by being willing to look at information clearly, even when that information was inconvenient, recognized that the same obligation applied here. She had to look at this clearly. She had laughed at a man named Ethan Walker in front of his 7-year-old daughter because he was withdrawing $50 and wearing worn clothes, and she had assembled a complete story about him out of nothing but those two facts. The story had been wrong. Not just wrong about the details, wrong about what the details meant. And somewhere in this city this morning, that man was probably making breakfast for his daughter and getting her ready for school and moving through his Tuesday with the same unhurried calm he'd carried into that bank because her opinion of him had not cost him a single thing he cared about. While she had not slept well in 2 days. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. She didn't have his number. She didn't know how to reach him. And she told herself that was probably fine. Probably this was something she would carry forward as a lesson and apply to how she moved through the world from here on out. And that would be the end of it. But even as she told herself that, she knew it wasn't true. Because the woman who had built Sinclair Digital out of a two-person apartment operation did not believe in unfinished business. And this was unfinished. She just didn't know yet how to finish it, or whether the man in the flannel would give her the chance. She found him through Gerald Hooper. She wasn't proud of it. She told herself on the drive to the bank Wednesday morning that it wasn't the kind of thing she normally did: use professional relationships to access personal information, leverage one connection to get to another. She told herself that twice before she walked in, and both times it rang slightly hollow, the way justifications tend to when they're working too hard. Gerald was at his desk when she came in. He looked up and something moved briefly across his face. Not surprise exactly, but the specific alertness of a man who has been half expecting a visit and is now recalibrating what it means that the visit has arrived. "Victoria," he said, "I didn't have an appointment with you today." "No," she said. "You don't. Do you have 10 minutes? He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat down. He waited. She had prepared several versions of this opening on the drive over. The professional version framed around business interests, the indirect version circling around the point and letting Gerald draw the conclusions, the direct version which she had talked herself out of twice because it felt uncomfortably close to something she wasn't used to feeling in professional settings. She went with the direct version anyway. "The man who was at Danny's window yesterday morning," she said. "Ethan Walker. I'd like to reach him." Gerald's face did not change in any dramatic way. He folded his hands on the desk with the deliberate patience of a man who has had 11 years of practice at revealing less than he knows. "May I ask why?" "Because I behaved badly," she said, "and I'd like to address it." A pause. Gerald looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decode. It was somewhere between respect and something more cautious. "Victoria," he said carefully, "you understand, I'm not able to share customer information." "I understand that completely," she said. "And you also understand," he continued in the same careful register, "that if a customer wanted to be reachable, they would make themselves reachable." She held that for a moment. It was a message delivered in the precise, polite language of a man who was telling her something significant, while technically telling her nothing at all. Ethan Walker was not difficult to find because he was nobody. He was difficult to find because he had chosen it. "Understood," she said. She stood up. Gerald stood up with her. They shook hands the way they always had, professional and appropriate. She was almost at the door when he said quietly, "He comes in most Tuesday mornings, with his daughter." She turned around. Gerald's expression had returned to fully neutral. "Historically speaking," he added, "for what it's worth." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Thank you, Gerald," and walked out. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 11 minutes without starting the engine. Her phone buzzed 4 times with things that needed her attention, and she let all 4 of them buzz. Tuesday mornings. She had a week. The thing she did not examine too closely in those 11 minutes in the parking structure was the question of what she was actually planning to do. Walk up to a man in a bank lobby and apologize. That was the surface version. That was the version that sounded reasonable and proportionate when she narrated it to herself. But underneath that, if she was honest, was something more complicated, because Victoria Sinclair did not drive across town on a Wednesday morning and sit in a parking structure for 11 minutes over a proportionate response. She did that kind of thing when something had genuinely shaken her, and she needed to locate the source of the shaking, and the only way to do that was to go toward it rather than away from it. She had been running toward problems her entire career. This felt like the same instinct. directed at something considerably more personal. She started the engine and drove back to the office and did not mention to anyone where she had been. Over the next 6 days, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She watched herself. Not her business decisions, not her strategy, not the outputs she was producing. She watched herself in rooms. She watched herself in the elevator with the building's maintenance crew and noticed the way her eyes didn't quite meet theirs. She watched herself at a restaurant with colleagues and noticed how she spoke to the server, not unkindly, but not quite fully either, not with the same attention she gave to the people at the table. She watched herself in a parking garage when a man in a delivery uniform asked her if she knew where a specific suite was, and she gave him directions quickly and accurately, and then immediately returned to her phone, and she noticed that too. None of it was monstrous. None of it was the kind of thing that would show up on a list of cruelties. It was smaller than that. It was the accumulation of 1,000 invisible decisions about who was worth the full weight of her attention. And it had happened so gradually over so many years of operating in a world that sorted people by what they appeared to have that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. Tuesday came around faster than she expected. She was at the bank by 9:15, earlier than he'd been last week. She got in line, actually got in line, the regular line, the velvet rope line that she had been standing well to the side of last Tuesday, and she waited with the genuine civilians of the Tuesday morning banking world, the retirees and the young parents, and the small business owners with their zippered deposit bags, and she stood there and waited and told herself she was not nervous. She was absolutely nervous. 9:47. The glass door opened. She knew it was him before she fully turned around, which made no rational sense given that she had seen him for under 3 minutes a week ago. But something in the quality of the lobby's ambient noise shifted in a way she couldn't explain, and she turned, and there he was. Same flannel. Different one navy blue this time, but the same quality of worn-in and deliberate. The same, I am exactly comfortable in this energy that she remembered. Emma was beside him in the yellow jacket, still with the fraying sun on the pocket, holding one of his hands loosely, the way she had before everything changed last week. He didn't see Victoria immediately. He was looking at Emma, who was telling him something with the focused earnestness she apparently brought to most communications, her free hand gesturing to illustrate a point. "But if the other team had more points, how did we win?" Emma was saying. "Because in that league, they count assists differently," Ethan said. "That doesn't make sense." "A lot of things don't make sense until someone explains the rules to you. Then why don't they just explain the rules first?" That, he said, is an excellent question. Emma seemed pleased with this answer. She was about to follow up when she looked up and her eyes landed on Victoria, and for one suspended moment, the lobby was very quiet. Emma recognized her. That was clear and immediate, and there was no ambiguity in it. The child looked at Victoria with those serious brown eyes, and she didn't look away, and Victoria felt something happen in her chest that she couldn't have named with any precision, but that she suspected was the specific discomfort of being seen clearly by someone who has no interest in being polite about what they're seeing. Then Emma looked up at her father. Ethan had followed his daughter's gaze, and now he was looking at Victoria directly for the first time since she had heard him ask for $50 and opened her mouth. His face was completely composed. Not cold, not warm, not performing anything. Just present. Just looking at her with the same quality of unhurried attention that he apparently brought to everything. Victoria's prepared words evaporated. She hadn't realized until this exact moment how much she had been counting on the words. She had rehearsed this. She'd had 6 days. She had 3 different versions she could deploy depending on how the approach went. And all 3 of them had dissolved the moment those steady eyes met hers, and she understood that this man was not going to make this easy for her, not because he was cruel, but because he had no particular reason to make anything easy for anyone who hadn't earned it. She said the only thing that was left. "Mr. Walker." She heard her own voice measured, but not quite as steady as she'd wanted. "I was here last Tuesday. I don't know if you remember me. I remember you, he said. A beat. Emma had not looked away from Victoria. Her grip on her father's hand had tightened. Not the frightened tightening of last week, but something more watchful. Evaluating. I'd like to apologize, Victoria said. For what I said, the comment I made. She paused. It was wrong, and I said it loudly enough that you heard it, and your daughter heard it, and that wasn't an accident on my part. I wasn't trying to be cruel, but I also wasn't being careful, and the effect was the same. I'm sorry. Silence. Not uncomfortable silence exactly, but weighty. The kind of silence that a real apology creates when it lands in front of a person who is actually listening to it. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at Emma. Something passed between them, the particular private language of a parent and child, who have spent enough time as a two-person unit that they've developed a fluency the rest of the world isn't fully let into. Emma shrugged. It was a very small shrug, but it was something. Ethan looked back at Victoria. I appreciate that, he said. Not, I accept it. Not, we're fine. No problem, forget about it. I appreciate that. The specific language of a man who was acknowledging the gesture without releasing her from the weight of it. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. He waited. How did you not say anything last week? She was aware this was not the question she had planned to ask. She was asking it anyway. You knew I was wrong. The bank manager came out, everyone in the lobby knew something was off about what I'd assumed. You could have said something. You chose not to. She paused. I want to understand that. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not a full smile, not quite, but something moved in the vicinity of his eyes. Emma, he said without looking away from Victoria. You remember what I told you on the sidewalk last week? Some lessons are better when they arrive on their own. Emma said immediately, like she'd been keeping the sentence ready. He looked back at Victoria. She's a good student, he said. Victoria stared at him. You were teaching her. I'm always teaching her, he said simply. Whether I mean to be or not. That's the deal when you're a parent. They're watching everything. He glanced down at Emma briefly. Everything. Victoria absorbed this. She thought about what it meant that in the worst moment of that Tuesday, when she had laughed at him, and the room had followed, his first calculation had not been his own dignity. It had been his daughter's education. What does Emma learn from how I respond right now? She felt something shift somewhere deep in her chest, not dramatically, but definitively. I've been doing research, she said. Then she stopped herself. Actually, I don't want to make this about what I found out. I want to be clear that the apology isn't because of what I found out. The apology is because I laughed at a man and his daughter in a public place, and I was wrong to do it regardless of what's in his account. Ethan studied her, that calm, thorough attention. But you did research. Yes, she said, and... She met his eyes. And I found out that I've been building my company in part on infrastructure that exists because of decisions you made years ago when nobody was paying attention. A pause. Which companies? He asked, and something in his voice was not quite the flat, controlled register he'd been maintaining. There was something in it now, a mild alertness, the tone of a man who has just realized the conversation has moved into territory he didn't anticipate. She named it. The company. The one from the newspaper article, the one she'd found at 11:30 at night with her cold wine and her laptop. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's a coincidence, he said. Is it? Another pause, longer this time. No, he said, and the word came out with a different quality, quieter. Probably not. Emma, who had been following this exchange with the sharp attention of a child who understands she's watching something important without fully comprehending what tugged her father's hand. Daddy, what does infrastructure mean? The things that hold other things up, he said, still looking at Victoria. Emma considered this. Like the floor. Yeah, he said, like the floor. Victoria looked at the little girl for a moment. Then she said, "Emma, I owe you an apology too. Not just your dad. You were there. You heard what I said. And you were kind enough not to say anything back, and I want you to know that I noticed that." Emma looked at her with those measuring eyes. Then she said with the direct, unfiltered honesty of a child who has not yet learned to cushion her assessments, "You have nice shoes." Victoria blinked. Ethan made a sound that was clearly a suppressed laugh quickly managed. "Thank you," Victoria said. And despite everything, despite the week of poor sleep and the research and the discomfort of standing in a bank lobby, doing the hardest thing she'd done in years, she felt something release in her chest. Something that had been held tight since Tuesday morning finally loosened its grip. "I'm going to be honest with you about something," Ethan said. His voice had shifted again. Still measured, but with something more open in it now, some door that had been carefully closed and was now fractionally ajar. "I've met a lot of people in this city who have judged me by what I looked like, more than I can count, and most of them I walked away from and never thought about again. That's the honest truth." He stopped. "Let that land. But you're the first one," he continued, "who showed up the next week." Victoria held that. "I don't know what that means for either of us," he said. "But I notice it." It was not forgiveness, technically. It was not the clean cinematic absolution she had half imagined in the 6 days of waiting. It was something more specific and more real than that. The acknowledgement of one person by another, both of them present, neither of them pretending the week hadn't happened. "I'd like to have a conversation sometime," she said. "Not about business. I'm not trying to turn this into a networking opportunity. I want to be clear about that." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I try to understand how you see things," she said, and she was surprised to hear how much she meant it. "Because whatever framework you're operating from, it's different from mine. And I think the Tuesday morning proved that mine has some problems." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Emma, who had occupied herself with the velvet rope dividers again, and was testing whether they swung or stayed fixed. They stayed fixed. She seemed mildly disappointed, but accepting. "She likes to figure out how things work," he said, watching his daughter. "I can see that," Victoria said. "Hey. She gets that from her mother." His voice didn't change significantly when he said it, but there was something underneath it, a frequency she caught only because she was listening carefully. The particular weight of someone who carries an absence so long it becomes integrated into the sentence structure of daily life. She didn't press it. She wasn't entitled to that yet, and she knew it. "Give me your card," he said. Oh, she had not expected that. She reached into her jacket and produced the card, the clean, simple one with just her name and number, the one she used when she didn't need to signal anything, and she held it out. He took it, looked at it once, put it in his shirt pocket, the way a man puts something away when he's decided it has a use, but isn't certain yet what the use is. "I'll think about it," he said. "Bonne," which was not a yes, but it was not a no either. And from a man who had told her plainly that most people who'd misjudged him, he'd walked away from and never considered again. It was a distance she hadn't expected to travel in a single conversation in a bank lobby on a Tuesday morning. She nodded. She didn't push. She turned toward the door, and then she stopped because something had occurred to her that she needed to say before she left. She turned back. "Mr. Walker," he looked at her. "I overheard you say something to Emma, last week on the sidewalk, through the window." She paused. "You crouched down to her level and said something, and she laughed. And I've been wondering all week what you said." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Emma, who was now counting the ceiling tiles. "She asked me if we could come back to this bank next Tuesday," he said. Victoria waited. "I told her I thought that was a reasonable idea," he said, "and that maybe by then the ceiling tiles would be different." Victoria looked at Emma, who had arrived at a number she was apparently unsatisfied with, and was starting the count over. "She was counting the ceiling tiles last Tuesday too," Victoria said. She counts them every time, he said. She keeps hoping the number will change. Does it? Never, he said. But she keeps checking. Victoria looked at this child who kept checking. This 7-year-old in the yellow jacket with the fraying sun on the pocket who kept starting the count over because she hadn't yet accepted that the number was fixed. She understood quite suddenly why Ethan found this charming rather than futile. The willingness to check again, the refusal to assume the answer was already settled. Maybe the number would be different this time. Maybe it wouldn't. But you checked anyway. She walked out into the Tuesday morning carrying that with her, and the card was in his pocket, and the conversation was unfinished in the way that real conversations always are. And somewhere in the space between the bank door and her car, she made a quiet decision about the kind of person she intended to be for the rest of her life. She didn't have it fully formed yet. She wouldn't for a while. But the shape of it was becoming clear, the way things become clear when you stop rushing past the parts that are uncomfortable and actually let them settle. She got in her car. She drove. Behind her, through the bank window, she couldn't see anymore. A little girl in a yellow jacket was starting her ceiling tile count over for the 3rd time, and her father was watching her with the expression of a man who finds the world genuinely interesting when his daughter is in it, and he had a business card in his shirt pocket that he hadn't decided what to do with yet. But he hadn't thrown it away. That was something. That was in the language of the man who had learned to be patient with the things that were not yet clear, actually quite a lot. He called on a Thursday. Not the Thursday right after the bank. The Thursday after that. 11 days after she had walked out with her business card in his shirt pocket and driven away, not knowing if she'd ever hear from him, and she had spent those 11 days telling herself that was fine, that was his right, that she had done what she needed to do, and the rest was not hers to control. She had mostly believed herself. Mostly. Her phone rang at 8:43 in the morning while she was in the middle of a budget review with her operations director, a man named Phil, who had been with Sinclair Digital for 7 years, and had the particular talent of making complex numbers feel like a conversation rather than a report. She saw the number unfamiliar local area code, and something moved in her stomach that she didn't have a clean name for. She said, "Phil, give me 2 minutes," and stepped into the hallway. "This is Victoria," she said. "It's Ethan Walker." A pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3, where neither of them said anything, and she became aware of how her own heartbeat had shifted register. "Mr. Walker," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd call." "I wasn't sure either," he said. "To be honest with you." She appreciated that. The honesty of it, the way he didn't dress it up into something more comfortable. "What changed your mind?" "Emma," he said. She waited. "She asked me about you again last night." His voice had the quality she'd come to associate with him in the limited time she'd spent in his presence, measured, deliberate, like every sentence had been considered before it was released. She wanted to know if the lady with the nice shoes was going to come back to the bank, and I told her I didn't know, and she said... He paused, and she could hear something in the pause, an affection so deep it had become structural. She said, "She seemed like she was sorry, Daddy. Really sorry. Not just saying it sorry. Victoria was very still in the hallway. 7 years old, Ethan said quietly. She's 7. She's remarkable, Victoria said, and meant it with every part of herself. She's her mother's daughter, he said. And then before Victoria could respond to that, he continued, I'd like to take you up on the conversation, if the offer's still open. It's still open, she said immediately, then making herself slow down. When works for you? Saturday morning. There's a coffee place on Meridian, the one with the green awning. You know it. She did. She'd driven past it a dozen times without going in because it didn't have the right kind of visibility from the street for the kinds of meetings she usually held over coffee. I know it. 9 o'clock, he said. Emma has soccer at 10:30, so I have a hard stop, just so you know. 9 o'clock is perfect, she said. All right. A beat. Victoria. Yes. I want to be clear about something before Saturday. His voice was even but direct. The voice of a man who prefers the map laid out plainly before the territory is entered. I'm not coming to talk about money or business or any of that. I know who you are professionally, and I respect what you've built. But that's not why I'm coming. I understand, she said. I'm coming, he said, because my daughter is a good judge of character, and she thinks you meant it, and I've learned to take her assessments seriously. The call ended, and Victoria stood in the hallway for a moment with her phone at her side, and something warm and unfamiliar moving through her chest. Then she went back into the budget review and told Phil she was sorry for the interruption, and gave him the rest of her attention, and she did a better job of it than she'd expected, because something had loosened somewhere in the architecture of her morning that made it easier to simply be where she was. Saturday arrived with the particular quality that early fall Saturdays have in that part of Tennessee. The air doing something between summer and something else, not quite committing the kind of morning that feels like a held breath. Victoria was at the coffee place on Meridian at 8:51. She got a table near the window and ordered a black coffee and sat with it and did not look at her phone. Ethan came in at 9:02, and without Emma, which she hadn't anticipated. He was wearing a different flannel today, dark gray, the same quality of worn comfort, and he moved through the coffee place with the self-contained ease of a man who is at home in ordinary rooms. He spotted her, nodded once, went to the counter and ordered, and came to the table. He sat down across from her and looked at her with those steady, patient eyes and said, "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for calling," she said. They were quiet for the moment, not the anxious quiet of two strangers with nothing to say. The quieter kind, the kind where both people are aware that what happens in the next hour matters, and they're each taking a moment to make sure they arrive at it correctly. "Where's Emma?" she asked. "With my neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge. They're making banana bread." Something crossed his face. "Emma takes the recipe very seriously. I've been told I'm not allowed to offer suggestions." Victoria smiled. "Smart woman." "Which one?" "Both of them, probably." He smiled at that, and it was the first full smile she'd seen from him. Not the fractional movements near his eyes that she'd catalogued from the bank lobby, but an actual smile, and it changed his face in a way that was startling in the best possible way. He looked for a moment younger, less carried. "How long has it been just the two of you?" Victoria asked, and then immediately said, "You don't have to answer that." 4 years, he said without hesitation. Emma was 3. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Her name was Claire. She had a brain aneurysm. She was here, and then 18 hours later she wasn't. No warning, no runway. Just gone. The word landed in the space between them with all the weight it deserved. Victoria didn't try to soften it, or redirect it, or fill the silence it made. "I'm sorry," she said. "Just that." "Thank you," he said. "Just that." They sat with it for a moment. And then, because he was the kind of man who moved through grief the way he moved through everything else steadily, without drama, without asking the world to make accommodations, he said, "The investing, the portfolio, all of it I'd built, most of it by the time Claire died. She knew about it. She thought it was funny, honestly. She said I was the only person she'd ever met who dressed like a hardware store manager and thought like a hedge fund." Victoria laughed, a genuine one surprised out of her. "She sounds wonderful." "She was the best person I ever knew," he said simply. "Emma has her practicality. The banana bread jurisdiction, that's pure Claire." Victoria looked at him across the table. This man who had carried 4 years of that particular weight alone, with a 3-year-old who had become a 7-year-old under his watch, and who had built a life and a fortune and maintained through all of it the specific kind of quiet dignity that she had walked into a bank lobby and laughed at. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a professional context in a very long time. Humility. Real humility, not the performed kind. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Go ahead. When you were making those early investments, the ones that nobody else was looking at, the pre-seed rounds, the companies that weren't legible yet, what were you seeing that other people weren't? He considered this seriously. Not performing consideration, actually considering. She appreciated the difference. I wasn't seeing more than other people, he said finally. I was waiting longer than other people. There's a difference. She leaned forward slightly. Explain that. Most investors, most people honestly, they need the story to be clear before they commit. They need the numbers to be right, the narrative to be clean, the risk to feel manageable. And by the time all that's true, by the time you can walk into a room and point to all the reasons why something is obviously good, most of the value is already gone. Someone else got there first. He paused. I learned early on to get comfortable with not knowing, to sit with something unclear and ask myself, do I believe in the people? Do I believe in the problem they're solving? And if the answer to both of those is yes, I'm willing to wait for the rest to come into focus. Victoria was very quiet. The problem, she said slowly, is that most people can't tolerate that kind of uncertainty. No, he agreed. They can't. So they wait until it's certain, which means they wait until it's crowded, which means they get a fraction of what they would have gotten if they'd been willing to not know for a while. She sat with that. She thought about her own company built on data and visibility, and expert consensus built on the things she could point to and defend in a room. Built well, genuinely well, but built in a way that had always kept her just behind the leading edge, smart enough to grow, not quite positioned to define. Is that how you see people too? She asked. He looked at her. What do you mean? The waiting, the willingness to sit with something unclear. She met his eyes. Is that how you saw me in the bank when I said what I said? Were you waiting to see who I actually was? Something in his expression shifted. He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. That would be generous to myself. In the moment, I was just trying to make sure Emma didn't see me be someone I'd be ashamed of in front of her. He paused. The other stuff, the waiting, the patience, I didn't decide to give you that. You came back and took it. She felt that land. When you say I came back and took it. You showed up the following Tuesday, he said. You didn't send an email. You didn't have Gerald pass along a message. You got in the regular line, and you waited, and you said it directly. He looked at her steadily. I've had people say worse things to me than what you said, and never think about it again. The fact that it bothered you enough to come back, that told me something. What did it tell you? That your character is better than your worst moment, he said. Which is true for most people, but most people never find out, because they never go back and look at the worst moment directly. Victoria stared at him. He said it so plainly. Not as a comfort, not as absolution, just as an observation. Your character is better than your worst moment. As if this were simply a fact he had assessed and filed. I've been thinking, she said after a moment, about the way I move through rooms, since the bank. I've been watching myself. She paused. It's not comfortable. No, he said. It isn't. I keep catching myself doing it. The quick read, the 2-second assessment. Not even consciously, it's just there, this automatic sorting. She looked at the table briefly, then back at him. How did you stop doing it, or did you? He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, an unconscious, methodical gesture. I didn't stop doing it, he said. I don't think you can stop doing it. It's wired in. What I learned to do was notice when I was doing it, and then stay long enough to find out whether I was right. He paused. Usually I wasn't. Usually there was something I hadn't seen in the first 2 seconds. That didn't make me stop reading fast. It just made me stop trusting the fast read as the final read. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street was moving through its Saturday morning, people walking, a kid on a bike, a woman pushing a stroller, with the focused determination of someone on a schedule. All of them being read rapidly and automatically by every brain that glanced at them. All of them more than the 2-second version. "I did something I want to tell you about," Victoria said. "After the bank, that week." She looked at him directly. "I went to Gerald Hooper and asked him how to reach you." Ethan's expression shifted. "Gerald wouldn't have given you my information." "He didn't," she said. "He told me you came in on Tuesday mornings, that's all." A pause. Then something moved across his face. 11 years he's been my branch manager," Ethan said. "He's never once done anything like that." "I think he wanted the story to have a different ending," Victoria said. Ethan was quiet, and she could see him sitting with something, reassessing something. Gerald Hooper, who processed transactions for people with every kind of account balance, who had built 11 years of professional discretion into the way he operated, had made a single small exception. Because a man in a worn flannel deserved better than what Tuesday morning had given him. "I'll have to thank him," Ethan said quietly. "I already did," she said. He looked at her. "When?" "Last Tuesday, after I left the bank." She paused. "I went back in. I told him that the conversation had gone better than I deserved, and that whatever he'd done, I was grateful." Ethan studied her for a long moment with that thorough, patient attention, and she understood she was being assessed. Not the quick 2-second sort she'd given him in a marble lobby. Something much slower and more careful than that. The kind of reading that waited to find out whether it was right. She let him look. She didn't try to manage what he was finding. "Victoria," he said, and for the first time he used her first name without her last, and something about that small shift registered in her chest. "What are you hoping comes out of this, all of this? The bank, the research coming back this morning?" She had been expecting the question. She had prepared for it in the way she prepared for hard questions in negotiations, having thought it through carefully, so the answer could be real instead of defensive. "I'm hoping," she said, "that I'm different at the end of it than I was at the beginning." He held that. "That's it," he said, not skeptically, genuinely asking. "That's everything," she said. "If I'm different, everything else follows from that. If I'm not different, then nothing else matters." He nodded slowly. The way he nodded when something had been confirmed rather than learned, the gesture of a man whose instinct has been met by a fact. "Emma's going to want a full report," he said. Victoria blinked. "I'm sorry." "She asked me this morning what we were going to talk about. I told her I wasn't sure. She said, 'Tell me everything when you get home, Daddy, every single word.'" He paused. "She uses that phrase a lot. Every single word. She means it literally." Victoria laughed, and it was the second real laugh in under an hour, and she was aware of how unfamiliar the frequency was, not the social laugh she deployed in rooms, the one that maintained the right kind of warmth and ease, but the laugh that arrived when you weren't managing anything. "What will you tell her?" she asked. He considered. "I'll tell her that the lady with the nice shoes is still working on something," he said, "and that I think she's going to be okay." Victoria held that. It was not the verdict she would have written for herself, the triumphant version, the one where the apology was accepted and the lesson was learned and the story wrapped clean. It was something more honest than that. Still working on something, still in the process. Not finished, not absolved, not done. She was okay with that. Actually okay not performing okay, the real version. "I need to get back for Emma," he said, checking his watch. "The soccer game. 10:30. The world of schedules and banana bread and ceiling tiles, counted and recounted." They stood up together, and he picked up both coffee cups and carried them to the counter without being asked, the automatic consideration of a man who noticed things without needing credit for noticing. At the door, he stopped and turned. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to think about it before you answer." She nodded. "My daughter has been asking me lately about what I do," he said. "The investing. She's old enough to start being curious about it, but young enough that the mechanics don't matter yet. What she keeps asking me is—" He paused, and his voice had something in it now, something she'd not heard in any of their previous exchanges. a quality of openness that costs something. She keeps asking why I believe in things that other people can't see yet, and I keep trying to find the right way to explain it to her. He looked at her steadily. What I realized this week talking to you is that there might be someone who could explain part of that to her better than I can. Someone who learned it differently and from the other direction. He paused. I'm not talking about a business thing. I'm talking about Emma understanding that there are different ways to see and that the right one isn't always the obvious one, and that it's never too late to change your angle. Victoria understood exactly what he was asking. She understood what it meant that he was asking it. I would be honored, she said, and she meant every syllable. He nodded once, opened the door. The fall morning came in briefly, that held breath air, the quality of something about to shift. Ethan, she said before he stepped through. He turned. Thank you, she said. Not for the conversation, for the Tuesday mornings, both of them. She paused. And tell Emma the ceiling tiles in the coffee place are 42. I counted while I was waiting. Something changed in his expression. That full, real smile again, the one that made him look younger. She's going to want to verify that herself, he said. I know, Victoria said. That's exactly why I told you. He walked out into the Saturday morning and she watched him go, and the door swung closed behind him, and she stood in the ordinary coffee place on Meridian with her ordinary morning and understood that something had happened in the last 2 weeks that she did not yet have language for. Something that had started with the worst version of herself and was moving slowly and honestly and without any guarantee of arrival toward something she liked considerably better. She sat back down. She ordered another coffee. She counted the ceiling tiles. 41. Or 43. She lost count twice. She started over. Emma counted 42. Meh. She announced this on the following Saturday morning, standing in the middle of the coffee place on Meridian, with her neck craned back, and her lips moving silently, while Ethan held her jacket, and Victoria sat at the same table near the window and tried not to smile too visibly at the intensity with which a 7-year-old was auditing her arithmetic. 42, Emma confirmed, lowering her head with the satisfaction of a scientist whose hypothesis has been validated. She looked at Victoria. You were right. I got lucky, Victoria said. I lost count twice. Emma slid into the chair beside her father, with the fluid unself-consciousness of a child who has decided apparently that this particular adult is acceptable. Daddy loses count too. He says it's because he's thinking about other things. I think it's because he goes too fast. Your father strikes me as a man who takes his time with things, Victoria said. Emma looked at Ethan with the evaluating eyes that Victoria had come to understand were simply how this child processed the world directly without social padding. Sometimes, Emma said, but not with pancakes. He makes pancakes too fast, and they're not fluffy. Ethan looked at the ceiling. We've discussed this. I know, Emma said pleasantly. You're still going too fast. Maud. Victoria laughed, and it arrived easily now, the real kind, the kind she hadn't had to locate or manufacture. 3 Saturdays in. This was the 3rd Saturday morning coffee, the 3rd time the world of banana bread and ceiling tile recounts and pancake jurisdiction had intersected with her own world, and each time she left Meridian, she drove home a slightly different person than she had been when she arrived. Not dramatically different. Incrementally. The way the best changes happened. This Saturday was different from the first 2 in one specific way. Emma was there. She'd been at soccer the first time and at a birthday party the second time, and Ethan had said casually on the phone, Thursday. Emma wants to come on Saturday if that's okay. And Victoria had said yes before he finished the sentence. And then she had spent the remainder of Thursday slightly nervous about it, which she had not admitted to anyone including herself for approximately 40 minutes. But Emma had walked in and immediately begun counting ceiling tiles, and the nervousness had dissolved into something warmer and entirely unexpected. She watched Emma now describing the soccer game from last weekend to her father with the precise, emphatic detail that children bring to athletic events, not just what happened, but exactly how it happened, and who said what, and whether the referee was fair, which Emma had significant opinions about. Ethan listened with full attention the way he listened to everything, and Victoria sat across from both of them and felt something she had not felt in a professional or social context in longer than she could accurately remember. She felt at rest. Not bored, not disengaged, not performing patience, actually at rest. The particular quality of ease that comes when you are not managing anything. Not your image, not the room, not the temperature of the conversation. Just present. Just there. She had been trying to locate that quality for most of her adult life, without knowing that was what she was looking for. Emma stopped mid-sentence about the referee and looked at Victoria with that direct, uncushioned attention. "Do you have kids?" "Emma," Ethan said, with the mild parental register of a man who is flagging a boundary without quite enforcing it. "It's fine," Victoria said. She looked at Emma. "No, I don't." Emma absorbed this without judgment. "Do you want some—" "Emma." Ethan's voice was slightly firmer. "It's a reasonable question," Emma said with the unassailable logic of someone who has not yet learned which questions are considered intrusive. "It is a reasonable question," Victoria said. "And the honest answer is that I used to think I didn't have time for them, and now I'm not sure that was true. I think I told myself I didn't have time because I was scared." Emma looked at her. "Scared of what?" "Of doing it wrong," Victoria said. Emma considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "Daddy does things wrong sometimes. He still does them." Something moved through Ethan's expression so fast, Victoria almost missed it. Not quite a wince. Something more honest than that. "She means the pancakes," he said. "I mean everything," Emma said serenely. Victoria looked at this child across the table. This practical, unsparing, entirely loving 7-year-old who had watched a stranger laugh at her father in a bank lobby and had tightened her grip on his hand, and then weeks later assessed that same stranger's apology as real rather than performed and had told her father to call. This child who recounted ceiling tiles, not because she expected the number to change, but because she believed in the checking. "Your daughter," Victoria said to Ethan, "is the most interesting person I've met in years." Emma looked at her father. "Can we have hot chocolate?" "Yes," Ethan said. She slid off the chair and went to the counter to order, because apparently she had standing permission to do this, and Ethan watched her go with the expression Victoria had identified by now as his primary expression when Emma was in the room, the look of a man holding something he is deeply aware he is lucky to hold. "She likes you," he said when Emma was out of earshot. "I like her," Victoria said. "Enormously." "She doesn't tell people when she doesn't like them," Ethan said. "She just gets very interested in the architecture, counts things, studies the room." Victoria thought about this. "She was counting ceiling tiles when she met me." "She was counting ceiling tiles before you spoke," he said. "That was last week. This week she stopped counting at 42 and sat down." He paused. "That's significant in Emma terms." Victoria sat with the warmth of that for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something. And I need to say it clearly because I've been thinking about how to say it for 2 weeks, and I don't want to get it wrong." He looked at her with those patient, steady eyes. Waiting. "My company is doing a new initiative," she said. "An internal one. Around how we make decisions, not business decisions, people decisions. How we assess the teams we bring in, the partners. We consider the individuals we hire or don't hire. I've been building a framework for it." She paused. "A lot of what went into that framework came from conversations with you." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to be involved," she said quickly. "I'm not trying to convert this into something professional. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that what happened in that bank lobby changed how I run my company. Not just how I move through rooms, how I actually make decisions that affect other people's lives." She held his gaze. I thought you should know that your patience with me had consequences. Good ones. Ethan looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. Can I ask what the framework looks like, he said. The core of it, she said, is a rule that anyone making a hiring or partnership decision has to write down read their 2-second assessment of whoever they're evaluating. And then they have to put it in a drawer for 48 hours before they act on it. She paused. And when they take it out, they have to ask themselves one question. What question? What did I miss? The silence that followed was the good kind. The kind that happens when something true has been said, and the room is giving it the space it requires. That's a good question, Ethan said. It's your question, she said. You just never said it out loud. He looked at her with something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not the warmth that appeared when he talked about Emma, not the patient composure he maintained when he was being careful. Something more unguarded than either of those. Something that looked, if she was reading him accurately, like being moved. Claire would have liked you, he said. Victoria went very still. He had not said Claire's name to her since the first Saturday, the morning he'd described losing her. He had referenced her in the margins of other things. Emma has her mother's eyes. Emma gets her practicality from Claire, but he had not said her name directed at Victoria, aimed at her as a thing he was choosing to offer. She understood the weight of it. She received it carefully. Tell me something about her, Victoria said. He thought for a moment. She laughed at everything, he said. Not mean laughing, the real kind. She thought the world was genuinely funny, and she was right about that more often than anyone I've ever met. He paused. She would have seen this whole situation, the bank, the $50, all of it, and she would have found approximately 7 things about it that were hilarious, and 1 thing that was devastating, and she would have handled both in the same breath. Victoria was quiet. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had apparently been both funnier and larger than most people in any room she occupied, and who had left behind a daughter who counted ceiling tiles and a husband who knew how to wait. She sounds like someone who knew how to hold a lot of things at once, Victoria said. Yeah, Ethan said. She did? He was quiet for a moment. Emma has that too, the holding. She's 4 years without her mother and she still holds her, every day. She doesn't try to resolve it or put it somewhere manageable. She just carries it and keeps moving. Victoria thought about her own losses. The smaller ones, the professional ones, the relationships she'd managed at arm's length because full closeness had seemed like a liability. The things she had put somewhere manageable because holding them was too uncomfortable. I've been doing it wrong, she said quietly. Not in an anguished way, plainly in the tone of a person reading a map and noticing they've been on the wrong road for a while. No, Ethan said. You've been doing it the only way you knew how. She looked at him. There's a difference. A big one, he said. Wrong means you should have known better. The only way you knew how means you worked with what you had. He paused. You know more now, so now you can do it differently. Emma came back with the hot chocolate, both hands wrapped around the mug with the careful transportation focus of someone moving a very important liquid, and she set it on the table with the satisfaction of a completed mission and climbed back into her chair. I didn't spill any, she announced. I noticed, Ethan said. Last time I spilled a little bit, but I went slower this time. Going slower helped, Victoria said. Emma looked at her with mild surprise, as if the answer were obvious. It always does. Victoria looked at Ethan over Emma's head. He was looking back at her with an expression that was a complete sentence, and the sentence was, yes, she knows exactly what she just said. Bimp to me. They stayed another 40 minutes. Emma told Victoria about a book she was reading, a chapter book about a girl who discovers a door in her grandmother's house that leads somewhere unexpected, and she described the plot with the enthusiasm of someone who has found a story that feels personally addressed to them. Victoria listened with real attention and asked real questions, and Emma answered them with the generosity of a child who finds it delightful when adults take her seriously. Betten at 10:25, Ethan said soccer. Emma looked at her watch, a small practical thing on her wrist, and said, "We have 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes to get to the car." Emma sighed with the theatrical weight of someone receiving moderately disappointing news and slid off her chair. She put on the yellow jacket. Still the same one, still the fraying sun on the pocket. Victoria had noticed it every time. "Emma," she said as the girl was zipping up. Emma looked at her. "I want you to know," Victoria said, "that you were right about me, in the bank, when you told your dad I was really sorry." She paused. "I was, and I am, and I've been trying to be better since then because of that." Emma looked at her with those serious eyes, evaluating. "I know," Emma said. "Not I thought so. Not thanks. I know." The specific certainty of a child who had made an assessment and trusted it, and had been watching it be proven correct for 3 Saturdays. She turned and headed for the door, already recalibrating for soccer, the jacket swinging behind her. Ethan stood. He looked at Victoria. "Same time next week," he said. She had not been expecting that. For 3 weeks she had not let herself assume continuity. She had shown up each time as if it might be the last time, as if the whole thing was provisional, as if she might arrive on a Saturday to find that his patience had run its natural course. Same time next week, as if it were already planned, as if there were no question. "Same time next week," she said. He nodded, started toward the door. She stayed at the table because she wasn't quite ready to leave the room that still held the warmth of the last 2 hours. He stopped at the door, turned back. The same movement he had made 3 Saturdays ago, the same slight return, and she had come to understand that this was when he said the things he'd been holding for the right moment. "You asked me once," he said, "how I stopped trusting the fast read." She remembered. The first Saturday. He'd told her he learned to notice it and wait. "I didn't tell you everything," he said. "The reason I learned was Claire. She called me out on it once early in our marriage. We were at a party, and I made a quick call on someone, and she heard me, and she said, 'Ethan, you do this thing where you decide before you've looked.'" He paused. I was embarrassed. I argued with her. I said I was usually right. And she said, "Being usually right is not the same as being always fair." Victoria was very still. "Being usually right," she said quietly, "is not the same as being always fair." "Yeah," he said. He held the door for Emma, who had doubled back to retrieve her hot chocolate mug and return it to the counter, because apparently the geometry of where things belonged was important to her. And then they were both through the door, and the bell above it rang once, and they were gone. "Dad." Victoria sat in the coffee place on Meridian and let the sentence settle into her like weather. Being usually right is not the same as being always fair. A woman named Claire, who was not in the world anymore, who had laughed at everything and held everything at once, had said that to her husband 20-some years ago at a party, and he had carried it and built a life around it and worn it so completely that it looked from the outside like simply who he was. And now it was in Victoria too. She would carry it into every room from here forward. She would carry it into hiring decisions and partnership meetings and Tuesday mornings and the ordinary moments where quick reads happened automatically and without examination. She would take it out and look at it when she felt the familiar pull of the 2-second sort, the automatic calibration, the confident story assembled from the flannel and the boots and the $50. Being usually right is not the same as being always fair. She thought about Marcus, who had smiled at her joke in the lobby. She thought about Derek, who had laughed more openly. She thought about the woman with the leather briefcase who had stopped smiling, and the older gentleman who had straightened up, and Gerald Hooper, who had come out of his office and crossed a marble floor, and then 11 years into a career built on discretion, said one careful sentence to a woman who needed it. She thought about a little girl who had tightened her grip on her father's hand and said nothing, and then weeks later told that same father to call. She thought about Emma counting the ceiling tiles, starting over. Not because the number would change, because the checking mattered.
Manise.
She took out her phone, not to check email, not to manage anything. She opened her notes and typed the sentence. Being usually right is not the same as being always fair. She tagged it with the date. She would look at it again in 6 months, and in a year, and in 5 years. And she suspected that each time she looked at it, it would have grown new dimensions she couldn't see from where she was sitting right now. That was the thing about real things. They kept revealing themselves. She got up, picked up her cup, carried it to the counter the way Ethan did without being asked. The young man at the register looked mildly surprised and said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and meant it completely, which was a small thing, and also not small at all. She walked out into the Saturday morning, and the fall air hit her with that almost changed quality. The held-breath feeling of something at the edge of becoming something else. The street was doing what streets do, indifferent, continuous, full of people, who were all of them more than their first 2 seconds. She didn't know walking to her car that morning what the next year would hold. She didn't know if Saturdays on Meridian would become part of the permanent structure of her life, or remain something more provisional. She didn't know if Emma would count the ceiling tiles again next week, or move on to something new to verify. She didn't know what she didn't know, and for the first time in longer than she could track, she found that genuinely interesting rather than threatening. What she did know was this: she had walked into a bank on a Tuesday morning as one kind of person, and the sequence of events that followed, a laugh, a child's hand tightening, a branch manager crossing a floor. 11 days of waiting. 2 Saturdays, 1 hot chocolate. A sentence from a woman named Claire had delivered her 3 weeks later to a different kind of person entirely. Not a finished person. Not a person with all the old instincts removed and replaced with better ones. But a person who now watched the fast read arrive and then waited. Who asked, "What did I miss?" before she acted. Who carried her coffee cup to the counter because she noticed it needed to be done, and not because anyone was watching. A person who had stopped counting on being usually right, and started instead on being always fair.
Barbie.
The work of that would take the rest of her life. She knew that. There would be days she failed it, and days she forgot it, and days she got it wrong in front of people who deserved better. There would be moments the old architecture reasserted itself, and she would have to notice it and choose again. But she would choose, every time. She would stop, and she would look, and she would ask the question, and sometimes the number would be the same as it was last time, and sometimes it would be different, and either way, the checking was the thing that mattered. That was what a 7-year-old in a yellow jacket had understood all along. That was what the man who wore flannel to a bank and withdrew $50 for an ice cream promise had lived quietly for years without needing a single person in any room to see him do it. Some lessons don't arrive in classrooms. They arrive in marble lobbies on Tuesday mornings, delivered by a child's grip tightening on her father's fingers by a branch, manager crossing a floor with purpose by the specific sound of your own voice saying something you cannot take back. The lesson doesn't ask whether you're ready, it arrives anyway. And what you become on the other side of it is entirely up to you. Victoria. Sinclair had laughed first. That would always be true. That Tuesday morning would always have happened the way it happened, and the little girl would always have heard it, and no amount of Saturday mornings or ceiling tile counts or sentences carried forward could undo those 30 seconds in the lobby of First National Bank on Caldwell Street. But she had gone back. She had stood in the regular line and waited and said it directly. And a man who had walked away from every version of that moment before, who had let the world's bad reads dissolve into the general background of a life built quietly and well, had put a business card in his pocket and not thrown it away. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was detail. You get the chance to go back. Most people don't take it. Victoria Sinclair did. And in the going back, in the deliberate, uncomfortable, unglamorous act of returning to the moment and looking at it directly, She found the only thing that a life of being usually right had never given her. She found out who she actually was. And she found out she could be better. That in the end was worth every single one of the $50.